July 24, 1943. Central Pacific. The sea lies smooth and heavy, a pane of molten glass under the morning sun. Inside the steel belly of USS Tinosa, the air is thick with oil, sweat, and breath held too long. But what everyone's really waiting for, what the sonarman counts in his headset, is the echo. That single, unmistakable boom rolling back through the deep. The submarine is fired again, its 14th torpedo. Another perfect run. The weapon strikes the hull of a Japanese tanker visible through the periscope. And then, nothing. No plume. No roar. No tremor underfoot. A stillness fills the control room. The captain curses under his breath, but the sonarman doesn't move. He knows that sound, that hollow return that means the torpedo hit solid metal and simply failed. Around him, no one dares speak. 2 years. Hundreds of lives at risk. Dozens of missions ruined. Maybe it ends now, he thinks, if someone has the nerve to break the rules. What the Navy called forbidden, he was about to test for himself. When the United States entered the Second World War in December 1941, its Pacific submarine fleet was small, cautious, and equipped with a weapon that existed more on paper than in practice. The Mark 14 torpedo was meant to be the Navy's proud, modern instrument of underwater warfare, fast, deep-running, and intelligent by design. It carried a 643-pound warhead and 2 fuses, one magnetic, one contact. On paper, it promised technological supremacy. In reality, it was scarcely tested under real combat conditions. The nation had spent the interwar years under budget restrictions. Live shots at target hulks or sea cliffs were seen as expensive indulgence. Instead, engineers relied on calculations, small-scale range trials, and a firm belief in their own precision. The Bureau of Ordnance, BORD, assured commands that every component worked flawlessly. When submarine officers questioned these claims, the answers came wrapped in authority. Trust the instrument. Any failure lies in the crew. By the first months of 1942, that faith began to crack. Submarines sent on the earliest patrols after Pearl Harbor returned with tallies that made no sense. Torpedoes struck Japanese freighters squarely amidships, yet ships refused to sink. Others missed entirely despite perfect sets. Commanders spoke in coded dispatches of erratic runs or premature detonations. Some, fearing reprimand, simply remained silent. For the men risking their lives in steel tubes hundreds of feet below, there was nothing theoretical about it. They watched bubbles rise where torpedoes should have exploded. They heard the hollow thuds of duds echoing through hulls. Each failure wasn't just mechanical. It erased hours of stalking and invited enemy escorts to retaliate with depth charges. The Pacific in 1942 became a proving ground for both courage and patience. At Pearl Harbor, the command repositories piled up log after log of unexplained misses. By mid-year, frustration turned to disbelief. Reports from Australia, Midway, and Fremantle told identical stories. Torpedoes running 10 to 15 feet deeper than set, exploders firing before reaching the target, or striking cleanly and bouncing off. Admirals still defended the weapon's reputation. To admit fault would be to confess that every sunk opportunity since the war began had been built on a false foundation. The sonarmen, torpedo mechanics, and junior officers heard whispers that something intrinsic was wrong. They lacked proof, denied ammunition even to test the theory. Orders forbade unauthorized firing. The Navy could not waste scarce torpedoes. That edict was law. But in dimly lit compartments, sailors began saving fragments, copying performance data, and sketching pressure diagrams after hours. They were building their own picture of a hidden truth. Several captains, Dudley, Mush, Morton, Charles Lockwood, and others rising through the ranks, were receiving the same reports from all corners of the ocean. The pattern pointed upward, not downward, technology, not seamanship. Yet at board's headquarters in Washington, admirals insisted that the device had performed within its design parameters, a polite phrase that meant operators are at fault. In the Pacific, war couldn't wait for committee reviews. The enemy was advancing, and every submarine failure meant another convoy unharmed. Lockwood, then commander of submarines at Pearl Harbor, kept a personal list of lost opportunities, ships that had escaped because someone ashore refused to test reality. Still, the Mark 14 remained standard issue. The crews were told to aim shallower, to fire statically, to check their gyros twice. Every adjustment solved nothing. Behind closed hatches, bitterness grew. Some whispered that perhaps the weapon had never been tested at full depth, an unthinkable notion for an organization built on engineering pride. By the end of 1942, U.S. submarines were straddling two worlds, one of official doctrine, another of lived experience. Between the two sat the petty officers, machinists, and sonar operators who bore the brunt of both. They were the ones forced to listen to silence after a hit, to watch their captains' faces tighten, to log another possible malfunction that higher command would later translate into operator error. From that smoldering discontent, a new determination began to form, the idea that if Washington would not conduct the right tests, perhaps the men at sea would. It would take both nerve and defiance, but somewhere, someone would eventually decide to risk a forbidden firing simply to know the truth. That decision, and the men who carried it out, would mark the end of the Navy's blind years. In early 1943, that growing rebellion of reason became impossible to contain. By then, submarines across the Pacific had a grim tally, dozens of engagements, hundreds of torpedoes launched, and a success rate that mocked the bravery behind every attack. Commanders began keeping secret notebooks, lists of failures, and sketches of recovered fragments, to prove that something inside the Mark 14 system simply didn't behave as advertised. At Pearl Harbor, Rear Admiral Charles A. Lockwood had reached his limit. Newly appointed commander of Submarine Force Pacific Fleet, he faced both a moral and mathematical crisis. Tonnage sunk reports had stagnated, patrol morale was collapsing, and the Japanese supply network remained unerringly intact. Lockwood understood what the numbers meant. His men were stalking targets with weapons that mostly refused to work. Still, Washington insisted otherwise. The Bureau of Ordnance maintained that torpedoes had passed every pre-war laboratory test. Its reports blamed the crews for faulty maintenance, poor tactics, even warm tropical waters that might affect magnetic fields. Suggestions to conduct full-scale live shots were dismissed as wasteful. To the men listening from half a world away, the response sounded like denial laid in polished prose. Locked inside this bureaucratic standoff were the technical details that made the Mark 14 so troublesome. It wasn't a single defect but three intertwined flaws, a trinity of frustration. First, the depth control mechanism had been calibrated in freshwater pools, not saltwater. The torpedo ran as much as 15 feet deeper than intended. Second, the magnetic influence detonator, the Mark 6 exploder, was tuned for polar magnetic fields. Near the equator, its sensitivity caused premature explosions or silent failures. Third, the contact exploder's firing pin deformed when striking targets at right angles, jamming instead of allowing detonation. Any one defect was dangerous. Combined, they produced a weapon capable of everything except reliability. Lockwood's captains began testing in fragments, small acts of defiance disguised as maintenance. They fired practice shots without warheads to check depth control. They measured the wake lines by eye and depth gauge. Slowly, their unsanctioned data built a picture that confirmed their fears. Reality contradicted every promise the Bureau had made. The sonarmen, those quiet listeners of the deep, played a crucial role. They could hear the rhythmic spin of the propellers, sense deviations in the gyro course, and recognize impact without explosion. Their logbooks became unofficial evidence cabinets. Every faint click of a dud, every hollow echo, was transcribed line by line. Among these sailors grew a conviction that the real enemy was no longer only Japan's war machine, but the Navy's refusal to see. Submarine crews whispered of the ghost fleet, boats haunted not by fear of detection, but by their own unreliable weapons. One misfire could turn hunter into hunted. By the spring of 1943, Lockwood decided subtlety had failed. He ordered live-fire tests at the Kahoolawe test range off the coast of Maui, despite Ward's disapproval. The results were damning. Torpedoes set to run at 10 feet averaged 25. Yet even this revelation didn't solve the detonator mystery. Rough seas destroyed instrumentation, and each torpedo loss cost the Navy tens of thousands of dollars. Washington insisted further testing would distract from the war effort. So field officers took matters into their own hands. On patrol, some captains began disabling the magnetic feature altogether, relying only on contact fuses. Others modified detonators with handmade corrections. And occasionally, when a chance arose far from oversight, they conducted what regulations explicitly forbade: unauthorized live war shot firings against cliffs, reefs, or derelict hulls. Among the men who executed those dangerous, it was an intimacy few wanted, that eerie responsibility to know instantly whether a weapon had worked or not. When so many torpedoes failed, the emotional toll was deep. The crews didn't measure victories in sinking reports, but in seconds of noise after launch. They could tell by pitch whether the warhead had detonated properly. When it didn't, frustration mixed with guilt. Every malfunction became personal. Sailors who had risked periscope depth and enemy retaliation felt betrayed by their own equipment. The strain leaked into conversations, into log entries, into the quiet bitterness of men who could do everything right and still watch the enemy sail away. The tension turned submarines into laboratories of endurance. Days stretched into weeks beneath the Pacific swell, where even sunlight seemed theoretical. Letters from home took months. The only constant was duty, and that imperfect torpedo they carried with them on every patrol. Tactically, the Mark 14 malfunction struck at the heart of submarine warfare. Each patrol was meticulously plotted: speed of approach, bearing, firing angle, evasion path. Commanders practiced these maneuvers until they became reflex. A single hit could alter a campaign. A single failure could expose the boat to annihilation. Submarines were supposed to fight unseen, hit and vanish. But when a torpedo misfired or detonated early, the illusion of invisibility shattered. Escorts homed in instantly. Within minutes, the ocean around a submarine filled with patterns of exploding depth charges. Pressure slammed into the hull, gauges trembled, and dust cascaded from the bulkheads. The weapon meant to protect them had instead betrayed their position. The Mark 14's inconsistencies forced captains into impossible choices: fire close and risk detection, or keep distance and gamble on a magnetically triggered detonation that rarely worked. Many began improvising firing patterns, double spreads, odd-angle shots, or sequences tuned by instinct rather. It was courageous, but chaotic. The American submarine campaign was slowly losing coherence beneath a fog of technical doubt. For staff planners in Pearl Harbor, statistical reports became puzzles with missing pieces. Patrol narratives showed repeated defective shots, but numbers on tonnage sunk appeared inconsistent. Morale wavered. A commander could return after a 60-day patrol with proof of multiple perfect attacks, and be met with skepticism instead of commendation. In a service tuned to discipline, doubt cut deeper than any reprimand. Yet this tactical desperation also bred adaptation. Crews became self-taught engineers, analyzing depth-keeping systems and gyroscopic steering units between patrols. They tuned instruments using makeshift tools, measured temperature and salinity of Pacific layers, logged environmental details the designers had never considered. Unable to trust the weapon, they began trusting one another absolutely. Submarine life fused men into communities bound by secrecy and shared danger. When a captain decided to risk an unauthorized live shot, he relied on the silence of every man aboard. No message could leak. The penalty for wasting ammunition or defying orders could end careers, and in wartime, there were graver consequences. Still, as the months passed, more crews quietly joined the unspoken rebellion of reason, prove the truth, no matter the cost. Out in the deep patrol zones off Truk, Rabaul, and the Marianas, these unauthorized experiments took place far from the eyes of the Bureau of Ordnance. Torpedoes fired not at enemy ships, but at steep cliff faces or uncharted reefs. Crewmen timed the runs, tracked depth by hydrophone tone, then recorded results in coded notes. Each test wore the thin cover of training exercise, but everyone understood it was something more, an evidence hunt. Those fragments of data, smuggled back to Pearl Harbor, gave Lockwood the leverage he needed. The results revealed alarming consistency. Every torpedo dived deeper than its setting, and contact pistols bit on perpendicular impact. For the first time, science backed what sailors had been risking their lives to prove. Still, bureaucracy resisted. Official reports labeled the results inconclusive, but underground memos and whispered briefings told another story. Among the submarine force, faith in the device turned into quiet contempt. The Mark 14 was now called the Dud Maker, a gallows humor nickname that spread through wardrooms from Fremantle to Midway. The only cure left was unequivocal public demonstration, something that no memo, chart, or verbal complaint could substitute. That demonstration would soon arrive, unplanned but undeniable. On a bright July morning in 1943, USS Tinosa stalked a massive Japanese whaling tanker, the Tonin Maru No. 3, just west of Truk. The submarine's crew, hardened by months of frustration, executed the textbook setup: perfect range, ideal angle, flawless timing. The first torpedo ran straight and true, detonated cleanly, and seemed to promise vindication. They cheered briefly. The second hit and failed. Then the third. Then the fourth. In the control room, the sonarman pressed his headphones tighter, logging each dull thud that followed impact. The commander recalculated bearings again and again, but every result was the same. The pattern of silence grew unbearable. 15 torpedoes fired, 13 direct hits without explosion. In that moment, months of rumor hardened into irrefutable truth. At its core, the catastrophe of the Mark 14 was a failure of process, not intellect. The engineers who had designed it were neither incompetent nor careless. They were trapped in a peacetime mentality that prized bureaucratic harmony over empirical evidence. During the interwar decades, the U.S. Navy's Ordnance Laboratories at Newport, Rhode Island, built the Mark 14 and its secret Mark 6 magnetic detonator under layers of classification so thick that even many submarine officers were forbidden to know how the mechanisms functioned. Testing budgets were cut, resulting in reliance on theoretical models. Inside those laboratories, prototypes were calibrated in freshwater tanks using test heads instead of live warheads. A few controlled runs were conducted inside Narragansett Bay under mild conditions, with predictable magnetic fields. Engineers, isolated from the strain of combat, saw perfect results and concluded their math was universal. The Mark 6 exploder, they believed, would detonate beneath a ship's keel by sensing subtle magnetic variations, an elegant, invisible trigger scheme worthy of scientific acclaim. No one had tested what saltwater density, equatorial magnetism, or the violent turbulence of combat could do to that delicate sensor. When Admiral Lockwood's officers later replicated a true Pacific firing environment, they discovered the brutal mismatch between laboratory neatness and wartime reality. It wasn't the torpedo that defied science. It was the bureaucracy that ignored it. The contact mechanism showed the same hubris in miniature. Its firing pin was a hardened steel rod sliding through a guide. When a torpedo struck bow on at high velocity, the deceleration forces bent that rod just enough to jam before striking the detonator cap. It was a detail an engineer might have caught with one full-scale test, but those tests were vetoed to save $10,000 per shot. In the end, 2 years of war consumed millions in wasted weapons and lost opportunities because of that single economy. To the sonarman or torpedo man, the Mark XIV's beauty lay hidden beneath frustration. They admired its speed, its smooth run, the purring of the dual propellers synchronized perfectly through the hydrophones. Technically, it was a masterpiece awaiting one missing truth, proof that human oversight had crippled it. No defect changes the course of a war unless someone insists on seeing it. For the Pacific Submarine Force, that insistence came from Rear Admiral Charles Lockwood. Courteous in manner yet relentless in conviction, Lockwood stepped into command with one goal: make the submarines lethal again. His correspondence reveals a tone of restrained fury, paragraphs laced not with emotion, but with logic sharpened to a nice edge. He wrote to Washington that field evidence must override office assumptions. He proposed immediate live shots using real warheads. The Bureau of Ordnance replied curtly, "No indication deficiencies exist." For Lockwood, that single sentence symbolized everything wrong with distant authority in wartime. Rather than escalate publicly, he turned to quiet rebellion. He ordered additional tests at Kahoolawe, using captured Japanese ordnance hulks as targets. He let his subordinate captains know, sometimes through implication rather than directive, that accuracy in reporting mattered more than adherence to doctrine. Slowly, the Pacific Command formed a network of officers united by empirical thinking. Their motto, whispered more than written, was simple: "If it doesn't work in saltwater, it doesn't work." This leadership defiance was dangerous, but transformational. It encouraged initiative among junior officers, such as torpedo data computer specialists and sonar chiefs, who had often been dismissed as mere technicians. Within months, these men became contributors to historical change. Lockwood's courage granted them moral license to test without permission, and those forbidden trials would expose truths that engineering arrogance had concealed. Every war presents choices between obedience and conscience, but few are as quietly profound as the Mark XIV affair. The sonarman who sat in the USS Tinosa's control room that July felt, not pondered, but felt, the moral weight of defiance. He was trained to follow orders, to fire only as directed, to waste nothing. He knew what the hollow thud meant. Another torpedo gone. Another target spared. Another convoy untouched. His decision to support further diagnostic firing after the action, to participate in what officially counted as misuse of ammunition, crossed a line etched by military law. Yet that crime, unrecorded in any court-martial, saved lives across an ocean. It exemplified the quiet heroism of technicians and petty officers whose judgment of physical truth overrode institutional fear. There were, within the Bureau, officers who privately admired that courage even as they denied it publicly. After the revelations, one staff engineer at Newport is said to have remarked, "They did what we should have done." In the ethics of war, where commanding officers must balance chain of command with ethical obligation, the Tinosa episode stands as a study in disobedience performed for the authenticity of science. Ironically, Japan's Navy initially misread the U.S. submarine campaign as deliberate restraint. For months, their shipping records showed numerous torpedo tracks and multiple unexploded hits. Believing American torpedoes to be weakly charged, Japanese engineers did not immediately alter convoy tactics. That misinterpretation bought time for Lockwood's eventual corrections to take devastating effect. Once the torpedo flaws were fixed in late 1943, Japan's sea lanes collapsed with astonishing speed, a reversal so abrupt that Tokyo intelligence units suspected the Allies had deployed an entirely new weapon. In truth, the new weapon was the old one set free from its mistakes. When USS Tinosa limped back to Pearl Harbor with her cargo of unexploded torpedoes and shameful silence, Admiral Lockwood ordered every surviving Dud disassembled under armed supervision. The test that followed would expose the technical heresy Washington had refused to believe, and at last vindicate the sonarmen who had listened to failure for far too long. The morning of July 24, 1943 dawned pale and windless over the Central Pacific. 1,700 tons of steel glided just below the surface. USS Tinosa, a Timber-class submarine on her second war patrol. Her captain, Lieutenant Commander Lawson P Daspit, had hunted Japanese shipping tirelessly around the truck approaches for days. By now his torpedo men and sonar crews were veterans of disappointment. They had seen the Mark 14 betray them too often. Yet morale remained stubbornly high. A massive tanker moved across the horizon, its silhouette filling the periscope like a dark continent of profit and enemy supply. The target was the Tonin Maru No. 3, one of Japan's largest whaling tankers refitted to serve the Imperial Navy. She carried thousands of tons of oil critical to fleet operations in the Central Pacific. To sink her was more than a tactical success. It was symbolic revenge for every dud that had robbed them of earlier victories. At 1,139 hours, Tinosa achieved textbook parameters: perfect range, ideal angle on the bow, gentle sea swell. The first torpedo left its tube with a muffled hiss, picked up speed, and struck directly under the engine room. The sonarman caught the unmistakable double crack of a successful detonation. Jubilation surged through the control room. At last, something had worked. The tanker slowed, wounded but afloat. Daspit prepared a second salvo to finish the job. Tube 2, fire. The second torpedo sped flawlessly, and delivered only a dull, metallic knock. No explosion. The shock of silence settled through the boat. He recalculated bearing, fired another. Click. Another. Click again. The sonarman's notes became a litany of absence. Hit! No detonation, solid impact, no explosion. Over the next 2 hours, Tinosa loosed torpedo after torpedo, each apparently perfect in depth and aim. The tanker, broadside and stationary, could not miss being hit. Yet 13 of the 15 shots failed. Inside Tinosa, disbelief turned to dread. Every miss invited risk. They could not surface to collect fragments. Enemy aircraft might find them at any moment. The captain's frustration reached breaking point. God, what do they use for detonators? Spitballs. One officer muttered bitterly. The sonarman kept his headphones pressed, listening to the clean, deadly thunk as each torpedo struck and stopped. The sound had become a curse, the sound of bureaucratic blindness echoing across an ocean. After nearly exhausting their supply, Daspit ordered ceasefire. The Tonin Maru No. 3 remained stubbornly afloat, pocked with dents and frozen torpedoes embedded like harpoons in a steel whale. He withdrew, heart heavy, and record books filled with incontrovertible failure data. When Tinosa arrived at Pearl Harbor days later, the atmosphere on the pier shifted from curiosity to shock. The submarine carried an intact unexploded Mark 14, recovered at great risk from the sea, physical evidence of systemic defect. Admiral Lockwood met Daspit personally, read the patrol report twice, and declared that enough was enough. In secret meetings at the submarine base, Lockwood ordered the torpedo examined. Technicians at the Kahoolawe Naval Laboratory dismantled its warhead under containment shields. The findings were immediate and humiliating. The firing pin block had been on impact, precisely as field officers suspected. Photographs of the warped mechanism telegraphed the truth to Washington faster than any formal complaint. Still, Lockwood wanted incontrovertible demonstration. He arranged a day of live testing at Kahoolawe, a volcanic island off Maui long used as an artillery range. Against a basalt cliff rising from the sea, torpedoes would be fired under controlled observation. Most of the Navy Ordnance staff predicted normal performance. The submariners, privately, expected another round of embarrassment, but for the Bureau this time. The sea that morning was like glass. Observers aboard small tracking vessels recorded each firing with film cameras and stopwatches. The first shot reached target depth, struck squarely, and silence. A second identical result. Then a third. It was undeniable. Physical proof that repeated contact destroyed detonation capacity. When the warheads were recovered, every firing pin nose bore the same distortion seen in Tinosa's specimen. Lockwood's anger, when it finally surfaced, was cold and articulate. "If my boys can't use these torpedoes, I'll go to war for better ones," he said to his staff, a line later immortalized in countless accounts. He sent the data to Washington with orders for immediate redesign, and, more controversially, he wired operational commanders. Disable the magnetic feature, rely solely on contact, though still trusting the flawed mechanism until corrected. It was a decision that walked the edge of insubordination. But it was only half the revelation. Beyond wrongdoing at an institutional level, the test ignited moral awakening among the lower decks. The sonarmen and torpedo men realized that their quiet persistence, every log of hollow echoes, every sketch of bent metal, every whispered doubt, had finally stripped illusion from command. For them, this was victory before any ship ever sank. When the tests at Kahoolawe concluded, the silence that followed was heavier than any explosion could have been. For the first time in years, no one aboard the observation ship spoke in defense of the Mark XIV's reputation. The facts were too loud. Officers examined the gaping contact pistols laid out on deck tables. Each bore the same deformity, a bent firing rod and a scar that told the story of thousands of wasted shots. It was there in the metal, undeniable and shameful. Lockwood stood over the wreckage, like a coroner pronouncing cause of death. The Bureau of Ordnances. Excuses evaporated in the Hawaiian sun. When his telegram arrived in Washington, it carried not a complaint but a verdict. Test conclusive. Contact exploder defective. Magnetic feature deactivated. Immediate correction essential. At the Navy Department, the revelation landed like a thunderclap. Some officers recoiled in embarrassment, others in defensive pride. For months, they had upheld the Mark XIV's perfection as an article of faith. Now they faced the proof of their own neglect. Inside small ordnance offices, engineers rushed to prepare statements claiming that the defect had already been understudy. But everyone in the chain of command knew the truth. The sailors in the Pacific had solved what the laboratories on the Atlantic had never dared to test. Lockwood wasn't content with bureaucratic acknowledgement. He ordered a full redesign of the contact exploder at Pearl Harbor's torpedo repair depot. 3 teams, composed not of senior officers, but of machinists' mates, welders, and torpedo men, set about reshaping the mechanism. They replaced the fragile firing pin guide with a sturdier cruciform design, installed shock-absorbing buffers, and widened tolerances. It was an elegant field solution born from pure necessity, executed with the urgency of war. Within weeks, the new contact pistols were tested again against the island's cliffs. This time, the cliffs answered with thunder. Each impact produced the long-missing roar that every submariner knew by heart. For Lockwood's force, it was a moment of emancipation. Submarine captains, who had once doubted their own competence, discovered vindication in sound and spray. Those distant Bureau officials could not hear it, but the sonarmen could, the deep, rolling echo of reliability restored. It was the music of vindicated science, of human persistence outlasting institution. Within days, operational orders swept across the Pacific, all magnetic features disabled, all Mark 14s retrofitted with the Lockwood contact, assembly effective immediately. The instructions rippled through bases from Pearl to Brisbane. At workshops, men worked around the clock under red lights, turning machine lathes, tuning detonators, grinding new pins until the deck smelled of hot metal and salt air. Submarines preparing for patrol doubled their effort, reloading tubes with weapons that finally inspired confidence instead of dread. The psychological shift was instant. For 2 years, the undersea fleet had operated with the nagging sense of fighting blind. Now, crews left port with a weapon they could trust. Captains became aggressors again, and even fatigue seemed to lift. One officer described the feeling in his patrol report as, "like breathing through both lungs again." Officially, it was classified notation. Unofficially, it was triumph. Meanwhile, reports flowed back to Pearl describing a transformation across the Pacific. Submarines once cautious now attacked with ferocity, closing to point-blank range, confident each torpedo would perform as intended. Japanese convoy losses soon spiked, evidence that repair of a single mechanical fault could alter the tide of an oceanic war. At headquarters, there was little fanfare. No grand announcement, no parade for the men who had challenged orders. The Bureau of Ordnance issued a terse notice identifying minor correction of impact detonator performance. Yet within the submarine community, that understatement was celebrated as proof that truth, however delayed, had prevailed. For the sonarmen, the quiet observers of every success and failure, the change was intimate. After 2 years of hearing only the dull click of contact, they could again mark the explosion in their headsets, an unmistakable low-frequency tremor followed by the tumbling of collapsing steel. They had listened to failure for so long that the return of that sound felt like the sea itself agreeing with them. Lockwood, ever the realist, refused to allow bitterness to linger. He recognized that the energy once wasted on argument was now better spent on victory. In internal memoranda, he pushed for systemic reforms, live-fire testing during development, inclusion of field officers in design evaluation, and respect for empirical data over bureaucratic assumption. His fight against institutional inertia became a template for the rest of the Navy and beyond. The new torpedoes went to sea almost immediately. August 1943 patrols reported unprecedented results. In one mission, submarines equipped with corrected weapons sank more tonnage than in the entire first quarter of the year combined. The statistical turnaround was stunning, but for Lockwood, the truer measure was morale. The silent service, long demoralized by its own ammunition, had found its voice again through the sound of working explosions. From that moment, the Pacific campaign changed rhythm. Submarines began cutting deeper into Japan's arteries of oil and supply, forcing the enemy to alter convoy routes and stretch escort resources thin. In hindsight, historians often mark late 1943 as the turning point of the undersea war. Few realize that the shift was not born in battle strategy, but in the patient outrage of mechanics and sonarmen determined to make physics obey truth instead of bureaucracy. By September 1943, the transformation was unmistakable. Patrol reports arriving at Pearl Harbor no longer carried coded laments about duds or premature explosions. Instead, they told of tankers broken in half, convoys scattered, and enemy warships disappearing beneath fields of rising oil and flame. The once mocked Mark 14 had become what its designers had always promised it to be, a lethal and dependable weapon, but only after the men who used it had forced the truth to the surface. Numbers confirmed what emotion already proclaimed. In the first half of 1943, U.S. submarines had sunk roughly a few 100,000 tons of shipping. By the end of the year, that figure more than doubled. In 1944, as newly corrected torpedoes spread through the fleet, sinkings would quadruple again. Admiral Lockwood's insistence that the magnetic exploder be deactivated and the contact pistol redesigned proved the single most economically significant decision in the Pacific Naval War. The enemy's lifeline of oil and transport cargo began to hemorrhage irreparably. Aboard the submarines themselves, the change was visceral. Crews described the first effective patrols as night and day. The morale that had ebbed through frustration now returned with forceful pride. Sailors who once watched strikes fail in silence could finally witness the thunder and shockwave of a successful detonation. The sonarmen, those quiet chroniclers of the war's underwater soundtrack, logged each explosion with almost artistic satisfaction. Solid contact, full echo, target breaking apart. Their notebooks no longer read like autopsies. They were birth certificates for restored confidence. From Pearl Harbor, Lockwood dispatched congratulatory signals across the fleet. The messages were brief, factual, written in his clipped style. Performance verified. Continue aggressive tactics. Beneath that understatement lay exhilaration. The submarine force, once marginalized, now became the cutting edge of the American naval strategy. Every successful patrol validated the courage it had taken to challenge authority. The Bureau of Ordnance, chastened but cautious, initiated corrective measures framed as routine refinement. Publicly, it described the errors as slight anomalies encountered under unique Pacific conditions. Privately, its officers acknowledged a systemic failure of testing philosophy. In closed-door meetings, procurement policies were rewritten to require live-fire evaluations before deployment. The new doctrine mandated collaboration between engineers and field commanders. It was reform born not of inspiration, but of humiliation, and yet it worked. The story of Tinosa spread informally across bases and training schools, usually stripped of classified details, but alive in spirit. In every retelling, the moral grew clearer. Facts from the field matter more than prestige from headquarters. The forbidden test became almost mythic, a parable whispered in classrooms and wardrooms as proof that courage could exist not only in combat, but in questioning flawed design. In operational theaters, the improvement had real human consequences. Missions that once required entire spreads of torpedoes to cripple a single freighter now accomplished the task with 2 or 3. Submarines could stay longer on patrol, attack more targets, and survive the inevitable hunts that followed each strike. The cumulative effect was staggering. By mid-1944, Japan's merchant fleet was collapsing faster than it could be replaced. The empire's industrial bloodstream, oil from the Indies, ore from China, food from Southeast Asia, was severed link by link beneath the Pacific's gray waves. Yet the men who made it happen received little recognition. There were no decorations for the sonarmen who had recorded those silent duds, no citations for machinists who risked punishment to file unofficial reports. Their reward was simpler and more profound: functional torpedoes and the knowledge that they had forced an institution to listen. Among the submariners, that was honor enough. Standing at his headquarters on the hill above Pearl Harbor, Lockwood could watch returning vessels raise broomsticks from their periscopes, a traditional symbol that meant mission accomplished. Each broom told him that another convoy lay shattered below the sea, and that the hard-won truth from Kahoolawe was paying off in tonnage and morale alike. The Bureau of Ordnance's admission of failure, when it finally emerged, was as subdued as it was overdue. In late 1943, a Navy communique circulated quietly through official channels acknowledging detonation inconsistencies identified and corrected. It was bureaucratic grammar designed to obscure the enormity of the mistake. But within the submarine fleet, the words needed no translation. They meant validation. The long-ignored voices from the Pacific had been right all along. At Pearl Harbor submarine base, the torpedo depot became both workshop and monument. Machinists who had hastily rebuilt firing pins in July were now implementing standardized redesigns. They worked in shifts that never stopped, lit by hanging bulbs that made the entire depot glow through the night. Officers and enlisted men labored together on equal footing, rank blurred by common purpose. Every freshly modified pistol tested to perfection was a small act of redemption. Reports of operational turnaround reached Washington quickly enough to erase lingering resistance. By early 1944, Lockwood's field data showed that more than 87% of fired torpedoes were functioning as intended. For the first time since the war's beginning, the Navy possessed a weapon it both respected and feared. Fleet Admiral Chester W. Nimitz commented dryly in one message, "Submarines now paying dividends." The understatement hid appreciation for Lockwood, who had gambled his reputation to force reform. Yet not everyone escaped unscathed. Careers inside the Bureau quietly ended. Senior officers who had once defended the old tests were reassigned or retired under vague reasons. Their departures, while discreet, confirmed that institutional accountability had reached even Washington's marble corridors. For the engineers who remained, the lesson became doctrine. Future development would proceed only when verified under conditions identical to combat. In the Pacific, the moral momentum grew. Younger officers absorbed the Mark 14 episode as both warning and inspiration. They learned that technological confidence is not granted by authority, but earned through evidence. Torpedo men trained recruits with a mixture of pride and candor, explaining not only how the weapon worked, but how it had once failed. For them, honesty was part of maintenance. Among the broader Allied command, the American submarine resurgence began to alter strategic planning. British and Dutch naval observers sent astonished summaries, noting an exponential increase in Japanese shipping losses. Convoy routing changed again and again, forcing enemy destroyers to guard dwindling resources over ever-expanding areas. The silent service, once doubted, was now the sharpest blade in the arsenal. None of this erased the quiet debt owed to the mechanics, test crews, and unsung specialists who had risked careers to speak truth. Some of those original sonarmen were later lost in action, their patrols never returning. Their contribution survived only in the ordnance logs and the steady rhythm of functioning warheads afterward. In memorials built after the war, their names stand beside decorated officers, equal in moral weight if not in public fame. Lockwood continued pressing for structural reform long after the immediate crisis passed. He insisted on new review boards that included frontline commanders, advocating a culture where bad news would travel as fast as good. In speeches to officers' classes after 1945, he repeated the lesson again and again. War and science share one rule: nothing works unless it's tested. The Mark 14's defects, once an embarrassment, became part of Navy folklore, a cautionary tale taught at Annapolis and Newport alike. Cadets studying ordnance design learned about the perverse power of confirmation bias, about how paper confidence can endanger lives. They also learned about courage in unlikely places, a captain with the patience to document failure, a technician with the will to question diagrams, a sonarman with the ear to recognize truth through sound alone. By the time peace returned, the Pacific's trade routes were graveyards of ships brought down by corrected torpedoes. Japan's industrial collapse owed as much to those undersea hunters as to any aerial bombardment. When historians later charted shipping losses, the sharp upward curve starting in late 1943 traced directly back to that chain of forbidden tests. The story of the Mark 14 torpedo began as a lesson in misplaced faith and ended as a monument to disciplined doubt. Its failures were mechanical, but its redemption was human, hammered into existence by the persistence of sailors who refused to let hierarchy outrank reality. For Rear Admiral Lockwood, the ultimate victory wasn't measured in enemy tonnage, but in restored integrity. He had inherited a silent service paralyzed by suspicion and turned it into an army of empiricists. His real triumph was cultural, proof that courage on the battlefield has a twin in the laboratory and the workshop. Future generations of naval officers would quote his quiet mantra, "If it doesn't work in saltwater, it doesn't work." Below him, in the sonar rooms and torpedo bays, ordinary men had turned listening into revelation. They had transformed the abstract language of echoes and clicks into testimony powerful enough to reshape policy. Their forbidden experiment, the act of firing one more torpedo simply to be sure, became not defiance, but duty fulfilled. History rarely applauds technicians. It prefers victories with flags and speeches. Yet the war's arithmetic proves their worth. Once those corrected torpedoes entered service, the curves of shipping losses, morale, and Allied dominance all bent upward together. Each explosion that followed spoke for both vengeance and verification. After the war, as Pacific bases emptied and submarines rode home beneath tranquil skies, veterans carried an understanding deeper than pride. They had seen how easily authority can mistake dogma for discipline, how truth can be silenced until someone dares to measure it. In that sense, the Mark 14 was more than a weapon. It was an education in the difference between certainty and truth. The ocean eventually absorbed the noise of those final detonations. What remained was the echo, a reminder that even in the most ordered of institutions, progress begins with a question, and salvation sometimes arrives disguised as disobedience. In the quiet hum of a sonar room, one sonarman once heard silence where thunder should have been. He listened, doubted, and in doing so gave the silent service its voice. The sound of that courage still rolls, faint but steadfast, through the deep.